Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's orientation webinar for the 2018 Second Chance Act Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Program. My name is Greg Halls, and I'm a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. We'll also post that number to the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues we may not be able to resolve during the webinar. However, we are recording today's webinar and it will be posted on our website along with a copy of the slides used in today's presentation at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for questions from the grantees. To ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A panel on the bottom right hand of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible before we end today at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Greg Halls, and I'm a policy analyst within the Reentry and Employment Program at the Justice Center. The Reentry and Employment Program focuses both on strategies to help prepare people leaving incarceration for work, as well as on increasing the opportunities for work through building relationships with employers and reducing the policy barriers for work. Joining today's discussion is Andre Bethea, Policy Advisor at the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, as well as my colleagues Sherry Moses and Erica Nelson, who are also policy analysts within the Reentry and Employment Program here at the Justice Center. As we'll discuss later on, Erica, Sherry, and myself will be your technical assistance providers, so you'll be working with us directly moving forward. During today's presentation, we'll begin with introductions and an overview of the BJA, the Justice Center, and the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC. We will then review the grant goals, grant mandatory requirements, and we will discuss the role of your NRRC TA provider. We will conclude the webinar with time for questions. Contact information for each speaker will be posted at the end of the presentation. So now I'll turn it over to Andre to welcome you all.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, I am Andre Bethea, the Policy Advisor for the Second Chance Act Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Program at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, or BJA. On behalf of BJA, we would like to congratulate Connecticut, Delaware, Florida, Iowa, Louisiana, Minnesota, Navajo Nation, Nevada, Texas, Vermont, and Wisconsin on their Second Chance Act Planning Award. At BJA, our mission is to provide leadership and services and grant administration and criminal justice policy development to state, local, and tribal jurisdictions. Specifically, BJA provides funding to support reducing recidivism and improving outcomes for people returning from incarceration. Through the development and implementation of policy, services, and sound grants management, BJA strengthens the nation's criminal justice system and restores security in communities. The Second Chance Act has supported over $300 million in reentry services since it was passed in 2008. We are excited to share information on the requirements and deliverables of the Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Program during today's webinar. But before we do, let me turn it back over to Greg Halls to provide information on the Council of State Governments Justice Center and the National Reentry Resource Center.
Thanks, Andre. Sherry, Erica, and myself are employed through the CSG Justice Center, which is a national nonprofit organization comprising of approximately 120 employees that serve policymakers at the local, state, tribal, and federal levels from all branches of government. Our professional backgrounds vary extensively, but together we have decades of experience in law enforcement, community corrections, court administration, housing, mental health and addiction, state prisons, local jails, juvenile justice, law, education, workforce development, and victim advocacy. What bonds us together is a shared commitment to our mission, which is to provide research-driven strategies and tools to increase public safety and strengthen communities. You can find our website at csgjusticecenter.org and can follow us on Twitter at CSGJC. In addition to serving policymakers, the Justice Center provides technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees through the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC, which is funded through the Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. In addition to delivering technical assistance, the NRC also promotes what works in reentry and successes of grantees, advances the knowledge base of the reentry field, facilitates peer networks and information exchange, and provides information for people returning to communities and their families. We are constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. We encourage everyone who hasn't done so already to sign up for the newsletter by going to csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. The newsletter highlights Second Chance Act grantees, provides information on new publications and resources, as well as updates recipients on trainings and relevant news. Now I'm going to turn it over once again to Andre to begin reviewing the grant goal.
Thanks again, Greg. The goal of the Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Grant is to fund the development of strategic plans that are comprehensive, collaborative, and multisystemic, and their approach to increase public safety by reducing recidivism and increasing economic mobility for people returning to the community from incarceration. Ladies, gentlemen, grantees, this is not a typical approach for correctional systems and should not be considered as another project or program. Rather, the Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic IRES Planning Grant requires the engagement of cross-disciplinary state, local, and tribal executive leadership and the respective stakeholders from correction, reentry, workforce development fields, and employers, and planning a system-wide coordinated approach to ensure that the right people are connected to the right services at the right time, and that the policies and funding align with the unique needs of people returning to communities from incarceration. This will require breaking down the silos within your agencies and in the community, and ultimately work together to understand the unique needs of the people you serve and your system's capacity to serve them. Now I'll turn it over to Erica Nelson to speak about the deliverables and mandatory requirements for your grant.
Thank you, Andre. I am so pleased and excited to be involved in the Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Grant program. This grant program is the first grant program of its kind. The underpinnings for this grant extend from many years of lessons learned through research and piloting Second Chance Act programs and projects to reduce recidivism and increase the economic mobility for people returning to communities from incarceration. What we have learned is that there's no single approach to producing positive outcomes. The National Reentry Resource Center, or the NRRC, Reentry and Employment Program, has 3 key areas to reduce barriers to employment for people with criminal records. 1, building the skills necessary to be competitive in the labor market. 2, engaging employers in improving hiring practices pertaining to people with criminal records, and having those employers provide advisement on employment trainings offered in prisons, jails, and in the community that meet workforce needs. And 3, supporting opportunities to reduce policy barriers to employment, such as working with states to understand how a criminal record triggers collateral consequences for successful reentry, such as the inability to secure employment in certain occupations, occupational licensing, housing, rota restrictions, and the lack of access to education and other opportunities. To date, there are over 40,000 collateral consequences in state and federal law. 50% are employment related. As a part of this grant program, you will work to translate the lessons learned about building skills, engaging employers, and reducing policy barriers to improve recidivism and employment outcomes for the people in your state returning from incarceration. To do this, you would need to establish a cross-disciplinary executive level steering committee, a cross-disciplinary working group. You will need to create an industry advisory group of employers, complete a comprehensive process analysis and systems mapping exercise, and develop a strategic plan for addressing systems gaps and integrating the best practices from corrections and workforce development fields. All these items are mandatory requirements for your grant program. So let's talk a little bit about the purpose, role, and key players for the cross-disciplinary executive level steering committee, and then also the cross-disciplinary working group, respectively. The steering committee should include state leaders from executive and legislative branches, high-level correctional and workforce administrators, and local elected officials. The role of the executive steering committee is to champion an integrated cross-systems approach and hold agencies accountable for establishing policies and procedures that will accomplish shared objectives for your grants. Executive leaders are able to identify strategies to address state and local barriers. They can also pool what resources and funding that is available in your jurisdiction and align that funding with the needs of that jurisdiction. Assembling a group of committed executive leadership is crucial to successful information sharing, planning, and later the implementation phase of your collaborative strategic plan. While the executive steering committee makes high-level policy recommendations, the cross-disciplinary working group advises on matters regarding the day-to-day activities of reentry services in the correctional facility and in the community. This group should include key leaders from the correction system, such as administrators and program staff from community supervision agencies, as well as the correctional institutions. It should also include community-based reentry service providers, leaders from workforce development systems, such as members from local workforce boards, employment and training service coordinators, community college administrators, and community-based employment service providers. It is important that the working group represents diverse perspectives across corrections, reentry, and workforce development fields to guide the comprehensive process analysis and system mapping exercise, which is used to identify systems gaps. Although the steering committee and working group have different functions, they come together to identify strategies to allocate resources to reduce recidivism and barriers to career pathways. The industry advisory group of employers should include human resource and hiring managers from growth industries in your region. The purpose of the advisory group is to provide advisement on hiring needs, job training programs, developing formal partnerships with employers, and identifying barriers to accessing and advancing in careers. The Industry Advisory Group of Employers and the Cross-Disciplinary Working Group should identify whether employment training programs provided before and after release assist with building skills that employers seek. Each of these groups have different levels of knowledge and understanding of your system, which will contribute to the development of a strategic plan that's multisystemic, collaborative, and coordinated when reducing recidivism and improving economic mobility. As mentioned previously, as a part of the Second Chance Grant, your state will develop a plan to replicate lessons learned through research, Second Chance Act grant programs, and projects. In 2013, the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies, also known as IRES, white paper was published. This white paper was developed by a team of experts and supported by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and with guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor. The white paper speaks to strategizing or strategies for implementing evidence-based, best, and promising practices from corrections and workforce fields in order to reduce recidivism and increase job readiness. Can I get a show of hands from grantees on whether or not you all are familiar with the grant program and understand the IRES framework? Okay, I see 2 hands thus far. Okay, thank you. So I won't spend a great deal of time, I see a few more hands coming in, talking about the framework in full, but I do want to spend some time talking about the diagram you see before you. The diagram is called the Resource Allocation and Service Matching Tool. So the Resource Allocation and Service Matching Tool is heavily based on risk-need responsivity principles. And what this tool is asking for jurisdictions to do in order to provide best practices and target services accordingly is to use 2 assessments. One is the criminogenic risk and needs assessment to determine someone's risk to recidivate, and that is coupled with a job readiness assessment to determine whether someone's more or less ready for employment. From these assessments, people are grouped into 4 areas: either lower risk, more job ready; lower risk, less job ready; higher risk, more job ready; and higher risk, less job ready. And the idea is that based on those assessment results, jurisdictions, whether it's institutions, correctional institutions, or programs and services in the community, they could tailor services based on those distinct needs identified in the assessment. So when we talk about tailoring services for this population, in terms of improving employment outcomes, we generally look at whether someone is more or less ready for work. So if you have individuals who are in your system who are more ready for work, the goal is, or the primary goal is to help that person find and retain employment. So in this slide, you'll see a listing of opportunities or some best practices we know that works with helping individuals secure employment. On-the-job training, paid work experience, unsubsidized permanent employment, so that immediate connection to employment opportunities, job development and coaching, as well as retention and advancement services, and that includes higher education and training. For a less job-ready person, they may not be at the point where they could be connected to permanent employment right away. They may need some services to increase their education or build their employability skills. They also may need some more intensive skills building opportunities such as transitional jobs programs. They also may need non-skill related interventions, and this may be assistance with identification, housing, and other needs in order for them to be successful once they are employed. So in terms of working with individuals based on their risk to reoffend, what we know is that the services should differ. For high-risk individuals, they will need intensive case management. They may also need cognitive behavioral interventions to address the needs, the needs or the thought patterns that may lead to a person committing crime. In terms of connecting them to services, you want to work with higher risk folks before or immediately upon release. And this is when we're talking about agencies who are in the community. You also, with high-risk folks, want to ensure that there's strong coordination between their supervision agents and the reentry service providers, and that's, of course, if they're on community supervision. Individuals who are at a high risk to recidivate also could benefit from having a tremendous amount of structured pro-social activities. And what we know through research, depending on a person's risk, for high-risk folks, they could need upwards of maybe 70% of their time in structured activities. For a low-risk person, you don't want to necessarily do the same thing. They don't need intensive case management. Their connections to services, if you had to prioritize high-risk versus low-risk, I would say that you work with them upon release to the community. You also do not want to disrupt any pro-social ties that they already have in place. So when you're working with folks who are returning to the community, this model is to be thought of as a way of providing case management, but also as you think about the resources that are in your system, how to best apply those resources based on someone's risk to recidivate as well as their readiness for work. So now I would turn it over to Greg Halls to talk a bit about the comprehensive process analysis and systems mapping.
Hello again. The fourth mandatory grant requirement details the completion of a comprehensive process analysis and systems mapping exercise, which will help you to strategically map the process for connecting to before and after release, assess the information collection and data sharing capabilities across staff and organizations involved, and it will help you to identify any gaps or needs in your system and or the services that are offered. We anticipate that every grantee will develop their own systems flowchart after working with your TA provider to complete the planning guide, which we will share in the upcoming weeks. The systems flowchart should be included in your final strategic plan and should detail how you intend to integrate criminogenic risk needs and job readiness assessments and screening, as well as aspects of the resource allocation and service matching tool that Erica previously described. I'll begin by walking you through some of the key elements that should be included in your systems map. I will note that the flowchart example included on the next few slides are strictly for demonstration purposes. Your system's flowchart will be different and specific to your system, but it should incorporate some of the elements that I will explain. At the beginning, you should detail the steps for an individual entering a correctional facility. It should display the intake procedures, the frontline staff involved during intake, assessments completed, and should detail how the assessment results are shared and used to inform the next steps in the system. In this example, the flowchart depicts that the assessment results done at intake inform the facility assignment and program work assignments shortly after. As you follow the flowchart, you'll notice under pre-release planning that a criminogenic risk need and job readiness reassessment is done 9 months before release. The results of the reassessment should be used to guide clients through the system in the hopes of developing an individualized reentry plan. Essentially, you'd want to document the same information for both intake and the pre-release planning phase in your flowchart. Pre-release planning should also involve the delivery of targeted programming and services specific to each individual. Although this slide depicts 2 groups, your systems map could potentially branch off into the 4 groups that Erica just described. Lower risk, more job ready; lower risk, less job ready; higher risk, more job ready; and higher risk, less job ready. It is important for everyone to understand how assessment results inform the referrals to services. In order to do so, the systems map should detail the type of pre-release services offered to individuals in each group. For example, a systems map can visually depict that individuals who are at a higher risk for reoffending and are less job ready will receive cognitive behavioral interventions such as thinking for a change, while an individual that's at a lower risk to reoffend and are more job ready will receive resume building and assistance with job searching. The flowchart included on this slide depicts a system that incorporates the IRES framework for those returning on community supervision. The flowchart shows that individuals will be referred to a community supervision agent and/or a workforce development organization at least 6 months before release to begin establishing rapport and case planning. Your systems map should include a referral guide based on the assessment results and should detail the additional organizations and individuals involved, their purpose, and their procedures before and after release. Lastly, the post-release section of the systems map should outline the types of services and programs offered, the target audience for each service or program, and a referral guide for getting people enrolled into their respective programming. I want to reiterate that the total systems map should also depict how information is shared between organizations and the individuals involved. Adhering to the first 4 mandatory grant requirements and working with your TA provider will help you to achieve the 5th mandatory requirement in developing a strategic plan. Through your steering committee, working group, and industry advisory group, you may be able to identify additional job training and education interventions that align with the leading job industry in your area of focus. It is important to mention that each grantee's strategic plan will not be the same because they will be created to adapt to the specific gaps or needs of your system. For example, you may conduct a process analysis and notice that 100 individuals require higher risk, less job readiness programming, and realize that service capacity issues may exist in your system and you can only serve 50 people. Your strategic plan should include a solution to this issue, such as outsourcing for programming. Or you may conduct a process evaluation to determine if the assessments or programs/services are evidence-based and administered with fidelity. You may find that staff need refresher trainings or additional guidance with making referrals, so you'll incorporate opportunities for refresher trainings into your plan. Lastly, identifying policy and programmatic barriers to employment is necessary to building the economic mobility of the returning population. If done correctly, you could point out specific barriers to employment and potential solutions for methods for advocating for change in your strategic plan. Now I'll turn it over to Andre to briefly discuss your budget.
Thanks, Greg. Okay, grantees. You should not obligate or expend any funds until your budget has been approved by BJA. Representatives at BJA will contact the financial point of contact listed in your proposal when the budget has been approved. Once budget has been approved, please inform your technical assistance provider at the National Reentry Resource Center. Again, grantees should not obligate or expend any funds until your budget has been completely approved by BJA. Now I'll turn it over to Sherry Moses to speak about the role of your TA, technical assistance provider.
Hello, everybody, and congratulations again, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the course of the year. I'm going to start by discussing the role of your TA provider. Greg, Erica, and I will be supporting you throughout the planning process of your grant with technical assistance. And we're going to tailor our technical assistance to reflect your specific needs and goals. The TA will take the form of monthly phone calls with your team, site visits when needed, trainings, and distance learning opportunities. And of course, you're always welcome to contact us by phone or email throughout the month. We're going to be providing you with access to subject matter experts. The Justice Center, Council of State Governments Justice Center, has a staff of over 120 with experts in a wide variety of fields that could provide you with information or assistance if needed. We'll also be recommending publications and online resources to help you through this process. And we'll be hosting peer learning communities on a quarterly basis. And we know that many of you are going to have similar kinds of interests and concerns. So we'd like to think of all of you as a cohort together, and that you'll also be sharing the information and your expertise with the other grantees. Now, what are the expectations for grantees? The first expectation is that you meet your grant objectives, which are, of course, individual for each one of you. The second is that you complete your planning guide. We're going to be distributing a planning guide that will guide you through every step of the process of completing your strategic plan and doing all the activities you've heard about so far. Another expectation is that you use validated risk and needs assessment instruments and job readiness assessments or screenings, as well as the most appropriate evidence-based practices to serve your target population. And we expect that you'll track your progress just to make sure that you're moving towards your goals, and that you communicate regularly with your TA provider and seek help when needed. And I want to just remind everybody that, sometimes people don't want to talk about problems, but we really encourage you to contact us if you have any concerns or problems, because we're here to help you work them out. So each of you have been assigned a particular TA provider, Erica, Greg, or I, and you see the list here. And I think that most of you have set up initial meetings with one of us as well in the next week or so. I also want to mention Zafra Stork, who's a great resource, and she's the BJA State Policy Advisor, and she'll be the one that you would be working with if you have to change any of the conditions in your grant through the GAN process. Now, we have a bunch of useful resources for you as you move along in this process. Some of them have already been mentioned, like the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies white paper. And I really suggest that everybody really print it out and refer to it on an ongoing basis. When you have questions, you'd be surprised about how useful that document is. And we look to it all the time as well. There are also a number of other documents listed here, if you can go back a slide, about the IRES project. It was piloted in 2 sites in the last few years, in Florida, Palm Beach County, Florida, and in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. And there are a number of documents that these executive summaries and the 4 questions document that refer to this pilot program and explain what some of the pilot sites have learned through the process. And then we have a great new tool called the Self-Assessment for Employment-Focused Reentry Programs that will help you figure out, more for community-based programs that you might be working with to help you figure out if they have the capacity to meet the needs of the populations that have been discussed. Other resources that we have include employer engagement resources. As Erica mentioned, and you're going to be forming an employer advisory committee, and many of you may not have worked much with employers before. So we have a document called Strategies to Engage Employers in Conversations about Hiring Applicants with Criminal Records that gives hints about how to reach out to employers and what to say. And then there's a toolkit if you want to plan any kind of employer engagement events that has sample invitations and agendas and things like that you can use. And then we have other resources as well about reaching out to employers. We also have resources about policies that may hinder access to career pathways for people with criminal records, including the NICCC, which I think Erica mentioned earlier, that there are over 40,000 collateral consequences, which could be something like licensing regulations that prohibit people from entering certain kinds of careers. Well, the NICCC, which is National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction, lists all of those 40,000 collateral consequences, and you can search by state as well as by issue. So you can look at housing or employment in different kinds of areas, and that's a great tool as well. So now we're at the point of questions and answers. So I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have. I think just write it in the chat room. No questions so far, but please enter any questions or concerns that you have. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask my colleagues, what do you think is the question that people are most likely to ask on the first call? Any ideas? What are some of the common questions that you get in your TA?
So I think one of the questions, thank you, Sherry, it's Erica Nelson, by the way. One of the questions may come up is about the planning guide. As we mentioned before, a lot of the activities, whether it's the systems mapping exercise or identifying your target population, all those things will be guided by your planning guide. And we don't expect for you to actually have the final version of your guide by the time of our initial phone call, which, as Sherry mentioned, may be scheduled for next week or the following week. But you will be able to view that guide and start working on that guide in the weeks to come. So just to give you a little insight is that majority of the items and exercises are going to be guided through your planning guide. It's almost going to be considered as a workbook where you're going to be able to capture everything that you need to do in order to develop that strategic plan. Great question and great answer, Erica.
Any other questions that people have? Sometimes people are wondering who should be at that initial meeting. And I would suggest the key people that are responsible for this program that were included in the grant proposal or that are going to be key in terms of the implementation of the program. The first meeting is a good start to, where you'll be able to ask more specific questions about your program and get to know your TA provider and about the process and expectations in more detail. So everybody seems to know what they're doing. No more questions. Any final words from my colleagues? Okay, then. Well, we all look forward to working with you throughout the course of the year, and we have our contact information one slide back. You can reach out to any of the four of us, and I encourage people to, most of you have signed up for the newsletter, the NRRC, to get NRRC updates, but I would also recommend that you sign up for there are several specific newsletters on like juvenile justice and behavioral health, and there's one on employment and education. And I would really recommend that all of you sign up for that one too. It comes out once a month. Well, if there aren't any other questions.
I would also like to point out that individuals that did not receive the announcement for this webinar, it was because you weren't signed up to receive updates from the National Reentry Resource Center. So I would strongly encourage you to sort of sign up for the newsletter and the announcement so that you can get everything that we're sending out.
Okay. And there was a question about what were the newsletter recommendations. There's the content-specific newsletters. I would recommend especially the one on employment and education. And I think we'll send out a link to that. All of us, all of the TA providers will send you a link to that or tell you about it in the first call. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, and we look forward to working together over the course of the year.